So today, like most of the lectures, of course, I think this one in particular is very interesting because we're going to be talking about international institutions. And I want to start off today talking about why international institutions, when it comes to business, are so very, very important. And I want to remind every one of you that if you've taken Business 1301, and you've been here all semester, you kind of know that what we've talked about over these last two classes especially is how important forces are when it comes to affecting international businesses, right? I mean, businesses have to deal with external and internal forces. And the point of all the stuff we've talked about is to sort of set up the context of international business and to show you that those of you who go on to be managers, CEOs, whatever, if you work in an international business setting, these are the type of forces you're going to have to deal with moving forward and moving on. And these are things you're going to have to deal with on the international level, whether it's a political force, a legal force, things like that. These are things that can have, if there's a blunder, if done wrong, it can cost you and your company a significant amount of money. So today, we're going to talk about a few international institutions that can really impact international business in a variety of ways. Now, I want to start off, of course, by reading some quote, like I said before. And it's from Mark Malloch Brown, the former Deputy Secretary General of the UN. And he's talking about this in his book, I had it right here, The Unfinished Global Revolution. And it's directly from your textbook, but I think it's very telling. And your textbook starts off like this, talking about it. In a world where the atmosphere is warming, the global economy lurches from crisis to crisis, and massively destructive civil wars erupt. We need to learn how to use our global institutions better because our problems are too complex for individual nations to solve. Well, that's what Mark Malloch Brown says. And so he says, and he makes a call in his book, for institutions to rise to meet the challenges we face. And his main point is a special note. In our world of intense globalization, of increased globalization, as our world becomes more and more interconnected, these things are to become more important. And in fact, he says, because our world is so interconnected, because globalization is on the rise, it becomes less governable at the national level. And this is, again, why institutions, as far as he's concerned, is so important. Institutions are important to business decision makers because they provide ways to settle conflict and resolve disagreements. They also provide support and infrastructure for decision makers. So that's kind of some of the justification between Brown's quote here. So today we're going to need to look and examine the institutions that are most important to the international manager. I would say not only the manager and the CEO, but every employee stationed at a business site, whether it's domestic or really international. So we're going to begin with those that focus on global cooperation. These types of institutions, things like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund. And then we're going to end the class talking about types of institutions whose concerns are mainly regional. So before we get started, I'm going to have the first poll of the day. You can get a chance to write that out.
the input,
Yeah.
she can't touch it. I'll add it after the class.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a question to the class. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? International institutions have an important role to play in the world, and they should be strong. I know that's kind of a broad question, but I mean, I sort of want to gauge class opinion on the importance of international institutions. What do you think? Online or in class? What do you think? International institutions have an important role to play in the world, and they should be strong. In class? You have a comment? How about online? What do you think? Online?
I think they should be strong.
You think they should be strong?
Yes,
Why?
because international organizations can help to tie countries together throughout the world. And as international business increases so much, being able to form those bonds is really important.
Okay.
And their rules and regulations shape the global economy.
Okay.
I also, Professor, agree that they should be strong and that they're valuable. We've proved as a global economy that we do better when we trade and exchange information. So that's why it's so pivotal for us to continue to do that, so that we can continue to improve personally, emotionally, business-wise, and create new technology and share ideas and our values with one another.
Okay.
Well, you probably want them to be strong if they get the job done, right? However, if they're more detrimental, you probably don't want to give them that much power, in my opinion.
Say that again?
That you probably want them to be strong if they do good, whereas if they're more detrimental and don't get the job done, you probably don't want to give them much power.
Okay. I'm going to end the polling real fast, and everybody in class got this. I'm going to share the results with the class. A few of you said no, and some of you said maybe. I want to hear from those who said no and those of you who said maybe. Why do you think that? Spring 2021, what do you mean? Or is that just something different? Those of you who said no, or those of you who said maybe. In particular, those of you who said maybe. Why do you think that?
On occasion, they can enforce values that aren't shared between countries.
On occasion, they could enforce values that aren't shared by everybody? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have an example, or are you just making a general statement?
Pretty general statement.
Okay. All right.
What if there's like a certain level of corruption inside that organization?
What if there's a certain level of corruption inside the organization?
That to me would be too much power, kind of like what Jose was saying. And
That would be too much power.
yeah, if they had a lot of power.
So you don't think they should be strong?
I would say there's probably a balance.
A balance? Okay.
That's why I chose maybe.
Okay. Maybe. All right. Okay. That's good. That's good. So I'm just kind of gauging the class here as far as that goes. So when I'm talking about institutions, though, what exactly? I'm talking about a couple of different things here. So when I'm talking about institution, an institution is just something that sort of governs behavior, that influences or determines how things are done. Institutions are organizations that a group, society, and culture use to construct, to provide stability and meaning to social life. All right? They're a collection of norms that regulate the relations of individuals to each other. And this is one of the things that institutions do to provide stability and meaning to social life. Well, institutions are also important to business. They're important to business decision makers because they provide ways to settle conflict and, of course, resolve disagreements. Okay, and they provide that support and infrastructure for these decision makers. Now, institutions are also important to business because they sort of provide the basic rules and codes of conduct, written and unwritten, that limit and direct the decisions firms can make. In a way, they provide managers with the rules of the game, thereby reducing the uncertainty in the firm's external environment. Because the last thing a business manager wants to do is to create instability within a firm, and perhaps that instability comes from an external force. And there are two types of institutions we're going to talk about today: formal and informal. Now, a formal institution is one that is official and actually has the power to enforce the rules that it sets. If you step outside the rules, you face the threat of punishment. And I want you to remember that definition. It has the power to enforce those rules that it sets. So, some examples of a formal institution: it could be political, like an actual organization or body, and it could be something like, I don't know, the U.S. Treasury, or it can be like the laws that a body enacts. But institutions can also refer to something less concrete, such as custom or a way of doing things. And this is what an informal institution is. It's still important, but it sort of lacks enforcement power. To give you an example, how much, and I hope all of y'all do this, how much do you know what to tip when you go to a restaurant, right? Well, what is an accepted custom? If you're in an international business environment, you probably need to know these things. That's an example of an informal institution. Sure, you're not breaking any kind of law if you don't tip someone 15% or something like that, but you're expected to, in some cases, and failing to tip what is expected of you is a sort of violation of typical accepted behavior. To an extent, we are, quote unquote, governed by informal institutions, albeit in different ways from formal institutions. And so, whether formal or informal, institutions help to bring stability and order and predictability. And these are all very good things from a business perspective, because businesses, if you've learned anything, they like predictability. They like stability. They don't want too many variables coming at them at one time that might disrupt the day-to-day operations. There's also something else that your book mentioned that I thought is important. And it's very important for international managers to understand. And that is cognitive institutions. So what exactly do they mean by that? Well, cognitive institutions are collections of shared ideas that define reality by means of conceptual frameworks or schema that are usually neither explicit nor tangible. Examples abound, including duty, motherhood, good manners, and gender roles. In fact, cultures themselves are collections of cognitive institutions, the invisible aggregations of norms and values that often lie hidden in our minds without our explicit awareness. Now, a lack of understanding of cognitive institutions contributes greatly to the challenges international managers face. Okay? So you got to keep in mind cognitive institutions. Now, the first major international institution we're going to talk about today affects business in a variety of ways. But before we talk about it, we talk about what that institution does, we have to understand how and why that institution came about. And to do so, I'm going to take you back to the Commanding Heights, the first episode. All right? Or if you've taken me from history class, or a history class, we talk about this a lot. In World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, the war itself was something unlike the world had ever seen. 16 million people were killed. It devastated much of Europe in the process, and it really sort of changed the globe. And there's a reason that it's called the Great War, simply because of the great carnage. Not only did it have a psychological impact, it had a geophysical impact. World War I really literally changed the global map. New nations were created. Empires, like the Ottoman Empire, were destroyed. And it created the need for some sort of international institution to come in and try to avoid another catastrophe. Now, if you did take me for history, you might remember how gloomy many people were after World War I. The theme of the progressive era, which came right before World War I, was that society is progressive. That the ideals of Western civilization, democracy, the rule of law, freedom, would win the day. And in fact, if you've ever seen pictures of Europe before World War I, or listened to somebody talk about Europe before World War I, it was in some ways the most idyllic of times, all right? It was the Victorian world, especially in Europe. Things hadn't never been as great as they were before, but underneath all that, there were still these tensions going on, which would eventually cause World War I. And in fact, the Great War dealt a shattering blow to that belief, all right? This whole belief that society is progressing and things like that, and the world is idyllic. And it really kind of changed the map in many ways. Now, the US president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, was an idealist who had grand visions for both the US and the international community. Out of the ashes of World War I, he wanted to construct a sort of new world order built on international cooperation and dialogue. All right, yes, Woodrow Wilson had always been an idealist. He had been president of Princeton College. He at one time had a calling to be a minister, but he wasn't just kind of this idyllic person. He did have these grand visions. And he proposed something called the League of Nations. Nations would join this organization, this new organization. And the League of Nations was intended to settle disputes among all of these different nations, including things like trade, working conditions, health, etc. Things that would affect business, yes, but also very much sort of more than that. And this would be about achieving world peace and stability. As you can kind of see, Wilson and his idea is very idealistic. And the League of Nations was part of this Treaty of Versailles that ended the war, and it was ratified by a number of countries. But as an institution, the League of Nations was weak. The first problem is that while a US president was the one to suggest the League of Nations, in the first place, the US itself never even joined the League of Nations. There was a strong group of isolationists, people like Henry Cabot Lodge, and also Charles Lindbergh, and others in Congress who were very skeptical of Wilson's internationalism and who these people promoted a more isolationist America's First agenda. Wilson tried everything he possibly could to promote this idea. He would go from town to town trying to promote this idea for a League of Nations, trying to get people to write to their congressmen to support this League of Nations. Besides, he would say things like, well, we definitely do not want to come to a situation where we have to have another world war. We can have this League of Nations. This would prevent that. That is one of the things he's trying to promote. And he literally gave himself a stroke, touring the country, trying to build the support for the League of Nations idea. But the US never joined. But this League of Nations is also weak because it really had no body of enforcement, no body at all. So while its member nations could reach decisions about things, such as imposing sanctions on another, no one really had to follow its decisions because it had no way to back up its word. There was no enforcement policy. And so it was very weak. And in 1939, when the Second World War started, it was clear that the League of Nations, while maybe a good idea in theory, was ultimately a major failure. But by the end of World War II, things started to change. And by the end of World War II, people are starting to understand. And World War II was more devastating than the first. There was a death toll of about 60 million people. International leaders were ready to try again. And this time, you would have more support. Toward the end of the war, the big three leaders, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, discussed an idea for a new international organization at the Yalta Conference. And this would be an organization aimed at maintaining world peace and stability, much like the League of Nations intended to do. And this organization, even though Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually passed away before the end of World War II, and Harry Truman had taken his place, Truman took on these ideas as well. And pushing for this new organization would be just would be a strong point for Truman as well. He believed this also. And besides, everybody would agree, especially after what had gone on in World War II, things like the Holocaust and something like that. Something needed to be created. An institution needed to be created to prevent wars like what had happened in World War I and World War II from ever happening again. So we're talking about, of course, the United Nations. Henry Cabot Lodge had a quote. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., had a quote about the United Nations. And he says this organization, the United Nations, is created to prevent you from going to hell. It isn't created to take you to heaven. Okay, it's kind of strong words about the United Nations. But the United Nations has had a lot of the same goals that the League of Nations had, such as peacekeeping, handling disputes between countries, and facilitating economic cooperation among its member nations. As far as peacekeeping and things like that, one of the first times it was used as something I know a little bit about, something that became Operation Desert Storm, really, when we're talking about peacekeeping forces and things like that. But as you can tell by its continued existence, it has had longevity and success that the League of Nations never saw. This is true for a variety of reasons. Now, on a psychological level, the horrors of World War II, and this is, of course, I'm talking about things like the Holocaust, really drove home this need for an effective international body. Also, this time the U.S. actually joined, not like last time, but the UN also functioned differently than the League of Nations did. And unlike the League of Nations, it has a body that can make decisions that are binding of its members. Now, of course, nothing is perfect, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the criticisms today of the UN. But first, I want you to look at some main bodies of the UN and what they're supposed to do, okay? But before we get to that, I want to talk about how the UN directly impacts business. There are a couple of things it does in particular. It plays a significant role in international business. It sets about agreements to set technical standards and norms. UN efforts prepare the ground for investment in emerging economies and the development of their workforce through a focus on areas such as health, education, governance, and political stability. Various UN agencies address the downsides of globalization, such as terrorism, crime, drugs, and arms traffic. Some direct impacts on business that the UN is in charge of, and the UN handles and it helps and negotiates global agreements. Some of the things they do is, one, ships are protected by rules legitimized in UN conferences when they sail freely across the seas and through international straits. Commercial airlines have the right to fly across borders and to land in case of emergency due to agreements negotiated by the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is part of the UN system. The World Health Organization, as we all know, sets criteria for the pharmaceutical quality and standardizes drug names. And also, there's some other things, but here's one. The International Telecommunication Union allotment of frequencies keeps the airwaves from becoming hopelessly clogged, thus avoiding interference among radio transmissions. But let's go back now and talk about some of the main bodies of the UN and what they're really supposed to do. And let's start with the UN General Assembly. Well, the General Assembly is the main deliberative body of the UN. In the Assembly, every country that is a member of the UN is represented. When it started out, there were only 51 members. But today, there are 192. They debate all sorts of international issues. And during their general debate, any country can raise an issue that they want the body to discuss. And once the General Assembly discusses and debates an issue, it can then make a recommendation by passing a resolution. And it passes something like 300 resolutions a year. But that's it. The General Assembly, and this is important when we're talking about formal and informal institutions, think about this. The General Assembly has no power to enforce the resolutions it passes. And it can't make any of its member states actually really do anything. So the power of enforcement is sort of left up to the UN, another body of the UN Security Council. Now, gradually, the number of members on the Security Council has increased, but there are a total of 15 members. 5 of those members are permanent members who have veto power, which means they can disagree with something the Security Council wants to do, veto, and kill those plans. Does anyone know who the 5 permanent members are? Anyone? Take a guess. Countries. 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Probably not too hard to figure out.
United States, the UK,
United States and UK, okay.
Germany.
What'd you say, China? China? 2 more.
I think another student mentioned Germany.
Not Germany, but close.
The US, UK, Russia,
France,
China,
Russia.
and France, I think, yeah.
Yeah, France and Russia. So the China, Russia, France, the US, and the UK. Those are the 5 permanent members. The other 10 members rotate. Every year, the General Assembly picks who those 10 members will be and tries to create some sort of geographical balance. Some from Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, South America, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, etc. So what exactly does the Security Council do? Well, if 2 countries have a dispute and they bring it to the Security Council, they have to figure out how to handle the situation. Their primary goal is a peaceful solution. And sometimes they will send in what are called international peacekeeping forces. One of those events, of course, already mentioned already, where peacekeeping forces had to be sent in. That was, of course, Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. These are basically military forces drawn from a bunch of UN countries who are sent to particular hotspots to try and keep the peace, to keep things from getting out of hand. They are under the authority of the Security Council when they do this. In the meantime, if the Security Council itself decides that a country actually has done something wrong, actually broken the peace or committed an act of aggression, they can then decide to issue diplomatic or more typically economic sanctions. But there's a big but. Any permanent member of the Security Council can veto any substantive resolution and block it. So that kind of complicates things and limits the effectiveness of the Security Council. One of those instances I looked up a couple of days ago, and this is one of the criticisms of the UN Security Council. They don't seem to do enough. And journalists all over the world, people often criticize the Security Council for not really doing anything. And this is one of those examples. People criticize the UN, they criticize UN Security Council all the time, but here's one of those examples. And the headline of this article is "Hundreds Reported Killing Since Military Seized Power in February." And this is dated March 31st, 2021. And this is how the journalist starts off this article. The United Nations Security Council is becoming, quote unquote, increasingly irrelevant when it comes to addressing the crisis in Myanmar, says the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in that country. Quote, they've condemned the violence, but not the coup. Okay, this is what Tommy Andrews told the Currents Mountain Galloway, adding that the council's, quote, inaction is damning. I mean, quote, there's a reign of terror going on here in Myanmar. We have these marauding troops now going through neighborhoods, destroying property, and then shooting randomly into people's homes. So the Security Council, even though a body with a little bit of power, does get criticism. Okay, because in many ways, like these people are saying, it's simply not doing enough. So that's just an example of how some of the things that the Security Council does, or how they can be criticized, or their role. Then there are other bodies that are a part of the UN, such as the Secretariat, which is basically the network of staff who make up the UN. And right now, the 9th Secretary General, Antonio Guterres of Portugal, is like the head, the Secretary General, okay? The General Assembly appoints the Secretary General on the recommendation of the Security Council for a 5-year renewable term. And the Secretariat right now is Antonio Guterres of Portugal, which began his term in 2017. There's also the World Health Organization. And those of us who's spent any time listening to the news for the last year know how much the World Health Organization and COVID, in many of the reports, are kind of going hand in hand. And there's been quite a lot of news lately regarding that. But the World Health Organization is an arm of the UN, and they are concerned with international public health. So the last two UN organizations that have a more direct impact on businesses are the International Court of Justice and the Economic and Social Council. Now, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, does exactly what its title suggests, handles international legal disputes between UN member countries. Now, while the parties involved in these disputes are only national governments, a lot of times governments get involved for private business reasons. And the decisions the ICJ renders can have a huge impact on businesses. And here is a really boring example of that, as reported, but here's an example of that. And then I'll give you an up-to-date of this example. A few years ago, Somalia officially sued Kenya in the ICJ. They're fighting about maritime borders. At issue was a 40,000 square mile area of land off the coast of Somalia in the Indian Ocean that is potentially rich with oil and natural gas reserves. Somalia said that they tried to negotiate, but both the Somalian and Kenyan governments said that the territory was theirs, so that they're now in an impasse. So while the ICJ determines what international law has to say on that matter, Kenya just decided to go, they just went ahead and gave several international firms exploration contracts. On the other hand, the conflict and uncertainty also kept away other investors. The case is still ongoing, and the court is expected to rule in the upcoming months. But I say that to say this case has been around really for a long time, almost 10 years, 2013, 2014, something like that. The question is, if Kenya has already granted exploration rights, what's going to happen if the ICJ sides with Somalia? It'll be interesting to see. So you can kind of see with this example how the ICJ can directly affect business. And this is a report from Al Jazeera in March 15th of 2021, talking about this case, talking about this particular case and how complicated it is in the situation, how much it's, disintegrated a little bit. Kenya has refused to participate in hearings at the World Court about a maritime boundary dispute with Somalia over contested parts of the Indian Ocean, in a dispute that has strained the neighbors' diplomatic relations. This case was filed in 2014 by Somalia at the ICJ, the UN's highest court for disputes between states. And the decision could determine rights to exploit oil and gas in the deep waters of the East African coastline. But again, like most bureaucracies, things take a little time. But in this case, the ICJ, this particular case seems to go on and on and on. So the final UN body we need to mention is the Economic and Social Council. They interact with the private network, the private sector, to work on plans for economic development. A few years ago, for example, they had a big conference in Samoa called the Small Island Developing States Conference, the SIDS conference, on how to develop what are called small island developing states. These kinds of countries are small, remote, have limited resources, and they can see a lot of natural disasters here. But because they're developing, they sort of lack the infrastructure to handle, obviously, natural disasters like the resources available in developed nations. So at this conference, they focused on topics ranging from, quote, sustained and sustainable, inclusive and equitable economic growth with decent work for all, to climate change, to health and non-communicable diseases. A real wide variety of stuff here, as you can see. But you can see from this, the bottom line for the Economic and Social Council is intended to come up with plans for development in nations that need help, that need a little help here. The hope is that in doing so, you can create stability and then attract business and economic development. Because again, if I haven't made this point enough, this is the kind of thing, these are the kind of markets that international businesses like to expand into, those with stability. So, I'll ask you very quickly. We've been talking a lot about the UN. And so I have a question real fast. In your opinion, is the UN a formal or informal institution? The UN, a formal or informal institution? Anyone? Is the UN a formal or informal institution?
Formal,
Okay, why would you say that?
because it's legislated.
Okay, it's official?
I believe it's formal as well because they have the power to enforce some of the legislation.
They have the power, okay. Anyone else? Who here thinks it's informal? Does the UN lack enforcement powers? Do you think it does? Well, some would argue that the UN is an informal institution. Some would argue that. Okay? And the reason they would argue that is this. Except for the Security Council, the UN and its bodies don't really have the ability to enforce those decisions that they make. Okay? This leaves a lot of critics to ask, and we've seen this over the years. Okay, not just from the Trump administration and we heard it from some of the Obama administration and going back and people in general. Why do we even need the UN? Okay, what's the point? So you get some of these people who say the UN is totally useless because it ain't actually back up its decisions. And so I've got some ideas. I mean, you know, I kind of got some of your feedback, what y'all think. Is the UN a useful institution, you think? Is it useful? Should we go back to not having a UN? Should we leave the UN? Go on, pick a chance.
Professor, I have an opinion for both ways on its usefulness and its lack of being useful.
Okay.
So the first one, I think it's kind of like a secretary at an office, right? It has a purpose for mitigating certain issues from arising, right? But, you know, the secretary isn't the doctor, right? So though, you know, it's there for a purpose, I think there's, you know, issues that it doesn't do as well, right? But I think it's better with it than the cost of what we could possibly see without it.
Right. Okay. Good. All right. Okay. That's fair. Supporters of the UN say that the dialogue it encourages is what really matters, right? We don't want to go back to a time where small things sort of could easily break out into another world war. We don't really want to go back to something like that beforehand. But with so many diverse member nations, the fact that the UN manages to reach agreements on anything is impressive. And for the international businesses, it helps add that level of stability to an uncertain and unstable world that businesses really love. Okay? So let's go on. Now, let's talk about things from a financial point of view. Further stability in world support, further stability in economic development came about with another product of World War II, the Bretton Woods system. Now, the Bretton Woods is a place in New Hampshire. The Bretton Woods Conference was a big meeting among international powers right before the end of World War II. Everyone knew that the international economic system was going to have to be fixed. So in 1944, delegates from 44 nations got together in this town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods to try to work out how they were going to put things back together. After about 3 weeks, they decided on a couple of things that has had a dramatic impact on all of us since then. First, under the Bretton Woods system, all currencies would be pegged to the US dollar. So rather than gold, the US dollar would be the reserve currency for the international monetary system. The reason for this was that the US dollar was the only currency strong enough at the time. At the time is important. So 1 ounce of gold became worth $35, and you could convert it at that price. This helped minimize instability and risk associated with exchange rates. And so it helped facilitate, create, promote trade. Now, just a side note, President Richard Nixon got sort of rid of the system in 1971. And today we have floating exchange rates that fluctuate based on the market. Got rid of that gold system. Now, more importantly, for our purposes, the Bretton Woods system also saw the creation of a few new institutions. The International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the World Bank. Okay? We need to mention these briefly and what they are supposed to do. Okay? The whole point of the IMF is to make the international financial system more stable. For businesses, this, of course, is a good thing. This means predictability, right? The IMF lends money to countries to stabilize their economies and restore sustainable economic growth. Countries who are a part of the IMF all contribute money to a pool, and that's where the loans are drawn from. A nation who contributes more money can borrow more and also has more votes. Finally, we have the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the World Bank, both of which are aimed at providing long-term loans to developing or mid-level developing countries to build up that infrastructure needed to attract capital investment into businesses. We take for granted things like roads and bridges and water, but if countries don't even have stable infrastructures like these, they're not going to be able to attract businesses or engage in trade on the same level that developed countries do. But for all the IMF, the IBRD, and the World Bank do, they're still concerned with the economic financial system as a whole. My daughter knows better than to call me. Okay. Call me during class. When it comes to trade, sorry about that, everybody. What arguably has the biggest impact on businesses is the World Trade Organization, which is the only international organization dedicated solely to trade and making sure it happens smoothly. Now, the WTO, just to give you an idea, the WTO is a relatively new institution. And believe it or not, it wasn't really established until 1995, which makes it very new. And today it has 164 members. And think about this. The WTO and its members represent 98% of all world trade. Okay? Now, the basic principles upon which the global trade system rests, that come out of the WTO are very important. Your textbook talks about them, but let's talk about this one. First and foremost, what the WTO does is establish trading rules between all of its nations. It does this by using something called the most favored nation principle. If you've ever taken a little history, watched some news, watched some financial news over the last couple of years, you've kind of heard of this principle. The MFN principle ensures that trade among WTO members is fair. For example, if the US gives Britain a favorable trade deal, they also have to give that same deal to other WTO countries. This is trade without discrimination, right? In other words, the US can't favor British goods over, say, goods from a country like Ethiopia. If there's a trade dispute, the WTO has the power to intervene and determine trade practices to be fair or unfair. Some of the other principles that they negotiate, which are these norms in which global trade system rests, they promote freer trade gradually through negotiation. They promote predictability through binding and transparency. They promote fair competition. They encourage development and economic reform. 3/4 of the WTO members are developing economies, and those transitioning to market economies, they are active in the WTO's current Doha development agenda or extended conference. And finally, which is very important, moving forward, they're into protecting the environment. Members are permitted to engage in measures to protect the environment, including the health of the public, animals, and plants, but to apply these measures in the same manner to both domestic and foreign businesses. Okay, so the one area where the WTO hasn't really been able to make a lot of headway is in agricultural goods. Developing countries, which make up a huge portion of the WTO members, look at subsidies given to domestic farmers in other countries as unfair because they say it drives down the price of their own crops. Even the UN is critical of the negative impact these subsidies can have on developing countries. So they started to look at this really back in 2003 when they had a conference in Doha, Qatar, okay? Despite its seemingly good intentions, there are a lot of complaints from various ideological corners about the WTO. In fact, even before that conference in 2003, when the WTO held its meeting in Seattle in the late 90s, really all hell sort of broke loose. And anti-globalization protesters got violent. And Seattle actually begged the WTO to end its conferences early, this conference early. Now, these are anarchists and other people who claimed, that's what was reported, there were anarchist people who claimed to be angry about the negative effects of globalization, such as unsafe working conditions in poorer countries, and the triumphs of big corporations due to reduced trade restrictions, the impact on the environment, which is why it plays a prominent role now, or even the erosion of national sovereignty. But whether the WTO and the free trade it promotes is a good or bad thing is sort of up to you. But despite its criticism, it has opened up new markets for business. It led to economic growth and created stability, all of which have benefited international businesses. But because these benefits disproportionately benefit richer countries, other countries, especially developing countries, have signed on to what is called, and this is what we'll spend the rest of the class talking about, regional trade agreements. We'll just go over a couple of these to try to do what the WTO isn't doing for them. So let's talk about some of these. Because the WTO progress on trade liberalization and inequities of globalization has been real slow, things like RTAs, regional trade agreements, have grown to fill the institutional gap. The WTO reports that in 2018, there were 290 regional trade agreements currently in existence worldwide, as well as more than 170 additional agreements that had been announced for which notifications had been issued. Now, every WTO member is a member of at least one of these RTAs, and some members belong to as many as 30. We have regional economic integration then on a number of levels, and we'll sort of finish up talking about two of those specific examples. NAFTA, known as the USMCA, and the EU. Now, the most basic level of regional integration is something called a free trade area. And that is exactly what its name suggests. And one of the best examples of this type of kind of integration is NAFTA, which was created in the Bill Clinton administration in the early 1990s. This North American free trade agreement, which has been around since the 90s. This is kind of regional integration, free trade area that links all the countries of North America, Mexico, Canada, and the United States in an agreement that eliminates tariffs between those countries. Now, people who support NAFTA say that it creates new jobs, it increases living standards in all three countries, and can help develop Mexico, which would create a better market for U.S. exports. Now, this agreement, which the main goal was, of course, promoting economic growth by easing the movement of goods and services between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. There was a precursor to this called the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement that went back to 1989. And some of the stipulations of the early version of NAFTA was the removal of most tariffs and restrictions, the mobility of workers, the environmental policies, the wide range of agreements on agricultural, textile, and automotive trade. And just sort of evaluated agricultural trade in both directions between Mexico and the U.S. increased from 7.3 billion because of NAFTA in 1994 to 20.1 billion in 2006. Trade between the three parties currently accounts for about 80% of Canadian and Mexican trade and more than a third of U.S. trade. It increased export manufacturing in Mexico. Mexico was protected from the financial instability of South America. And, but there was sort of problems with this. There were environmental concerns in Mexico's industrial areas. Mexico was affected by a recession in 2001 and 2008. But in 2018, some of these concerns, as far as the U.S. goes, was losing manufacturing jobs to Mexico. From Mexico, there was U.S. migration policies, the high corn subsidies for U.S. farmers. In Canada, some of the concerns was energy trade policies and losing manufacturing jobs to Mexico. some of these concerns really started to rear its ugly head. And this is one of the reasons President Trump was also able to get sort of this Rust Belt vote or something like that. Some would argue this is one of the reasons, because those jobs that were prominent in those areas were affected by globalization and also things like NAFTA. And so it was renegotiated, and in 2018, it became the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. But on the other hand, some people say that there's nothing really to stop US companies from leaving the US for Mexico to set up shop and manufacture goods for much cheaper and sell them back in US markets. These people also argue that it takes jobs away from Americans and it reduced wages. The criticism started all the way back in the 1990s when NAFTA was being negotiated. When presidential candidate and Texas oil billionaire H. Ross Perot, he argued that NAFTA would create a quote unquote giant sucking sound of American jobs. So some, like I've said, in the Rust Belt probably argued that, at least for manufacturing jobs. But NAFTA and other free trade areas, and this is kind of where we stand now, are just the basic level of economic integration. However, in countries in these types of arrangements, still exercise control over restrictions over many things, such as the movement of people, money, and services. Here's some of the things that, because of the brand new legislation, this renegotiation, here's where we stand now. A brief overview of this more recent one. U.S. farmers get more access to the Canadian dairy market. The U.S. got Canada to open up its dairy market to U.S. farmers. A big issue for Trump at the time. Labor provisions. 40 to 45% of automobile parts must be made by workers who earn at least $16 an hour by 2023. Mexico agreed to pass new labor laws to give greater protection to workers, including migrants and women. Most notably, these laws are supposed to make it easier for Mexican workers to unionize. The sunset clause, the agreement adds a 16-year sunset clause, meaning the terms of the agreement expire or sunset after 16 years. The deal is also subject to a review every 6 years, at which point the US, Mexico, and Canada can decide to extend the USMCA. It was finally ratified January 29th. Let me see. Mexico had June 2019, Mexico became the first country to ratify that new deal, but it had problems in the US and Canada. January 29th, 2020, Trump officially signed the USMCA. Canada ratified the agreement in March, and the USMCA went into full effect on July 21st, 2020. But despite this new agreement, these governments and even companies are still adjusting to some of these new rules. But today, however, stepping away from NAFTA and the USMCA, we see there are much more complex arrangements and deep regional economic integration, especially in Europe, where the EU has gone from a common market to complete economic integration. A common market creates a single market among its member nations, so it standardizes barriers to trade, such as taxes. All of the countries involved will have common economic policies and allow for freedom of movement of people, workers, services, and money, but only within that region. An example of a common market would be the precursor to the EU, the European Union, which was the European Community. Gradually, however, this European Community grew. And by 1993, its members agreed to create a new kind of regional integration, one that would become the European Union. Now, the EU is an example of complete economic integration. Now let's I'm going to go back to that, but I'm going to show you EU enlargement. Starting all the way back, this European community has its origins and roots going all the way back to the 50s, when Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg were really some of the original members of what will become the EU. And this has grown over time. 2013, Croatia was the last country to officially join. But then, of course, in 1973, you had Denmark, Ireland, and UK join what would become the EU. But then, of course, with the Brexit vote, you know that the UK eventually left the EU. These countries involved have to give up quite a bit, including certain levels, and this is one of the reasons, certain levels of their national sovereignty in order to be members. This also has made the EU somewhat controversial. Hence the decision by British voters to exit the EU. It makes the organization more than just an agreement on trade or economic policy. It is everything. It makes the EU a true political body that has control over not only economic policy, but also foreign policy and other domestic affairs. So its impact, it's really far-reaching, and its decisions are binding on its member nations. So it's a formal institution, unlike, some would argue, the UN. And the EU really does function like a huge government. It has its own court, its own central bank that manages the market, its own currency for member countries, and it sets standards not only for members of the EU, but for anyone who wants to do business within the EU. And the EU has shown that it has different priorities than, say, the United States. So for example, the EU is way more concerned and therefore stricter about things like environmental protections or emissions or even intellectual property. So while the broad standardization that the EU has created means lower cost, this is important, even though this broad standardization means lower cost for doing business, you don't have to keep changing currencies because it has one currency, the euro. People can move between countries freely for work, etc. The policies it sets regarding things like the environment and standards of operation may impact businesses negatively, may raise costs, creates more and more layers of organization, of bureaucracy, which is in the end, sometimes some would argue, could cripple an organization in its attempt to be profitable. Still, it is interesting to note that there are more international businesses at the time, now headquartered in EU countries than anywhere else. Now, here's one recent example of the impact formal institutions like the EU can have on international business. This is a picture of the enlargement of the EU over time. Here's an example. From March 2019. Google was hit with a record-breaking $5 billion fine by EU regulators for violating antitrust laws. The European Commission found that Google unfairly forced its search engine and Chrome browser on consumers by requiring that Android device makers include search and Chrome in order to have access to the Play Store and other Google apps and services. Well, you might be wondering, well, why doesn't this apply to Apple? Apple forces its maps on people like me, but unlike Apple, Google allows third-party device makers to make Androids. And so European regulators have deemed this to be an unfair use of these companies and their devices to increase Google search's market dominance. As much stability as international businesses can bring, Google probably wasn't too big a fan of formal institutions when that decision came out. So international institutions may not be perfect, and sort of close like this, but at a basic level, they are trying to ease the cultural, political, and economic differences among the diverse nations of the world and promote more stability. And there's one final thing I wanted to say about institutions and why they matter. They matter because they operate to limit the international manager's available choices, thereby simplifying and codifying the environment. An international manager can benefit greatly by being aware of their strengths, limitations, and contributions. Because if you've learned anything so far, is that sometimes not understanding all the legal forces and the external forces that are in play that are against you, it can really do damage to an international business and the market that it tends to be in. So with that said, Samad's gonna come up here